Hello, everybody, and you're all very welcome to the third webinar in the winter series from BH Consulting, all about sharing knowledge that can help you get your organizations ready for the evolving cybersecurity and privacy landscape. I'll be your moderator. Gordon Smith is my name. We've got a packed agenda, loads to get through over the course of the next hour with not one but two expert speakers, and we've set ourselves a very ambitious goal of bringing things together from the previous two webinars by combining both cybersecurity and data protection into one single event. Just before we get underway, just to make you aware, we will be recording the webinar, but that's purely to produce material for BH Consulting's marketing. Your contributions in the form of the chat or the Q&A will be entirely anonymous. So today we're going to look at the impact of regulations on the security and privacy landscape. It's hard to believe that in May of this year, it will have been 6 years since the EU GDPR came into force, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's loads more coming down the tracks, and here to tell us all about it, we've two expert speakers. We're going to run the event as follows. First, we'll hear from Brian Honan, who's going to talk us through the cybersecurity side of things. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Valerie Lyons, who's going to talk us through what this means for privacy and data protection. So with that, I'll introduce Brian first. He's a recognized authority on cybersecurity. He's advised Europol, the European Police Agency. He's the founder of BH Consulting. Please welcome Brian Honan.
Cheers, Gordon. Thank you, and welcome along, everybody. It's good to see so many people join us today. I think it shows probably the challenge we all recognize as to what's coming down the line with regards to cybersecurity and privacy regulations that are going to impact our lives in many, many different ways. So what I'm going to talk about is the whole area of cybersecurity and what that means. I think, there is this old famous, allegedly Chinese curse / blessing, which says, may you live in interesting times. I think when you hear it first time, think, oh, that's nice. May you live in interesting times. But if you do think about it, it can also mean, wouldn't it be better to live in peaceful times where things don't change and things aren't interesting? And, if we do look at cybersecurity and indeed the privacy landscape, there's a lot of things happening that are going to make life interesting for us, particularly over the next 12, 18, 24 months. And, it's probably not lost in this audience that cybersecurity is a major risk. And this is echoed from the just published last week, the World Economic Forum's own global risk report for 2024. And I think, as you can see there, it shows that the risks to the global economy there's a top 5 risks there, but I've circled or highlighted 2 of the risks. The second bigger risk there is AI generated misinformation and disinformation. And the 5th largest risk is cyber attacks. Both of them are in the technology area, and both of them are going to fall under the remit of many of our roles and jobs, and indeed will be covered by some of the regulations we're going to talk about later on. And if you look at the top 10 risks for the next 2 years, misinformation and disinformation is high on the list there. And I think that's very pertinent if you want to take it from a global risk report. If you look at how many elections are going to be happening worldwide this year, and the other conflicts, etc., that are happening, that is just going to lead to a huge rise in misinformation and disinformation. And with the introduction of AI and everything that's behind that, that's just going to be, I think this year is going to be one of those crazy years yet again. And cybersecurity is the 4th biggest risk. Over the next 10 years, they do see those risks dropping, but they are still in the top 10. So it is something to keep our eye on. And the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report does highlight where some of those risks are coming from in a bit more detail. 74% of all breaches involve the human element, be that by error, misuse of credentials, privilege misuse, or social engineering. 83% of all breaches involve external actors, and 95% of attacks are financially driven. Ransomware is still the top breach type and breach risk there that we need to worry about. And if you look close to home, we have the whole area of with the Hiscox cyber readiness report in 2023. that 71% of Irish business suffered at least one cyber attack in the past 12 months. And that's a very, if you think about it, that's 70% of companies have had a crime committed against them in 2023. I don't think well, it'd be interesting to see, do we have the same level of crime in the physical world against businesses? Like, do 70% of businesses suffer crime in the physical aspect? But 70% in cyber attacks is quite large. This is the third year in a row that the number of attacks are increasing. Phishing still leads to be the biggest way of criminals breaking in to organizations and breaching them. And we can see criminals just keep demanding money more and more. Surprise, surprise, they're criminals. They want money. That's why they're doing this. And if they think you're an easy mark, they just come back and look to attack you again. And then the first point of entry generally tends to be in a corporate-owned server or a cloud server. Now, we're seeing these probably statistics over and over again, but I think what it highlights is we're failing as an industry in the aspects of cybersecurity. The technology that we're using maybe the questions have to arise: are they good enough? Are we deploying it correctly? Are we able to resolve cybersecurity properly? Are organizations really taking cybersecurity seriously? And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a whole raft of legislation and regulations coming down, and that's in response to governments, regulators, I think, sitting back and going, okay, we can't rely on the private sector or our industry, whatever you want to define cybersecurity industry as being, on self-regulation and getting this problem solved. The impact cybersecurity has on society, on citizens, on businesses, and the impact it can have, the disproportionate impact it potentially can have is just too great and too high a risk to our economies and our societies to leave unregulated. So we're now seeing, particularly from the EU, a lot of regulations coming through. I'll focus on mainly on the security ones, but here's a sample of what's coming through. As Gordon in the introduction talked about, GDPR came in 6 years ago. I'm not going to talk much about that. Valerie's a much better place to go into that space than I. But we are going to see the Network Information Security 2 directive come into place this year. This is going to affect organizations that are deemed to be critical to the infrastructure and economies of member states in the EU. Ireland is going to have to transpose a directive into Irish law, and the date for that coming into effect is the 17th of October this year. We have the European Cyber Resilience Act that's going to come through. Quite other few there, the DORA, the Artificial Intelligence Act, again, probably much more focused on privacy, and Barra hopefully will go through that. The European e-privacy regulation, the Digital Services Act, the DMA Act. There's the European Data Governance Act, the European Cyber Defence Policy, and the EU Payment Service Directive 2 coming through as well. Now, we could do a webinar on each of these regulations individually, but what we're going to do is just briefly talk about some of these. I've mentioned the Networks NIS2 directive coming into place in October. We actually worked with Huawei to Ireland to commission a white paper. A white paper on how NIS2 will impact SMEs in Ireland. There's the link for it there. I think if you do have time, you should go and have a look at that white paper. It gives you a good idea of what potentially could happen. Now, you may be sitting there going, well, Brian, I'm not a telco, I'm not a financial company, I wouldn't be deemed critical or an essential entity as per NIS2. But under NIS2, all those regulated bodies have to manage their security risk within their supply chain. So if you supply services to any of those organizations, or you supply services to organizations that provide services to those organizations, therefore you're in that supply chain, and those regulated entities will be looking towards you to be have adequate levels of cybersecurity in place. The Cyber Resilience Act, that's bringing in the whole area of certification and standards for products and services in being sold within the EU. So if you're a cloud service provider, you're potentially going to have to certify your cloud service to this standard so that you can provide it within the EU. Likewise, if you're providing a product, a software product or a hardware product, you need to be able to meet the certification standards, which are currently being working on by the European Agency for Cybersecurity. BH Consulting is part of the expert group helping them put together those standards. And so if you're going to be selling those products here in the EU, you need to be meeting those standards. Similar to if you're going to be selling an electrical product, you've got all the electrical standards and safety standards you have to meet. If you're in the financial sector, you've got the Digital Operation Resilience Act, or DORA, that you have to comply with to make sure your business is resilient and can survive cyber attacks. And again, in relating to financial sector, with the EU PSD2, the EU Payment Service Directive 2, which will be requiring that you does cover areas on cybersecurity to make sure that you can support payments in a secure way across different financial institutions. So there's a lot of stuff coming through. Some's going to be in this year, some's going to be next year, but it is going to impact our organizations in a big way. And it's going to impact the industry in a big way. We also, of course, have regulations outside the EU. I have a slide coming up next to talk about what's happening, or some examples of that happening in the US. We also have the Payment Cards Industry Data Security Standard. The latest version has just been published, PCI DSS. So if your organization processes credit cards in any way, shape, or form, via your website, over the phone, over the counter, by fax machine, by courier pigeon, or whatever way it may be, if you process credit card data in any way, shape, or form, PCI DSS applies to you. And that applies to you as well. We come across this quite often where clients say to us, oh, it's okay, our website, we do take online payments, but when you click to pay us, it goes to our payment provider and they do everything and they're PCI compliant. You also have to make sure your website is PCI compliant. So that is something that people need to be aware of. Cyber insurance, that is becoming more and more mature. The insurance companies are now looking to and demanding better levels and evidence of better cybersecurity in place when they're trying to put a policy in place. They're also looking at ways to reduce their own, obviously, liability and cover. So cyber insurance is going to be driving what we do as well. I know it's not a regulation, which is the topic of this webinar, but I think it's a big driver as well. There are going to be contractual obligations from customers. I touched upon this too, where those customers will be demanding you've gotten better cybersecurity as a result of that regulation, and other regulations will have similar impacts. We already see this with GDPR and data processing agreements having to be put in place between controllers and processors. So there is going to be bigger focus on securing the supply chain and making that much more secure. As a result, we're going to have more robust policies, better policies, and we're going to have to adhere to that. And we're also seeing, a bigger focus coming in on corporate governance and managing business. So to make sure that when it comes to business risks, which do include cyber risks, that was ethically just the right thing to do as a business, and to be a good corporate citizen, that you're managing those risks, and that you also identify material risks in annual reports, particularly if you're in a public traded company. And in certain countries, for example, in the US, it is now a requirement to highlight any cybersecurity breaches you've had in your annual reports. And in the US, we've seen a lot of this changing. The SEC in the US is that's a Securities and Exchange Commission. They're looking at cybersecurity breaches and kind of going, okay, what is the CISO's role in this? what are they obliged? And we can see some of the cases there. Joe Sullivan, the ex-CISO for Uber, who was convicted for covering up a data breach. We also see the CISO for SolarWinds, who also has been accused of misleading investors. Now, you can argue these are not direct cybersecurity things, but we now see, it's what I'm doing is we're highlighting the focus that regulators are taking on cybersecurity. So as the regulators get more focused on cybersecurity and are looking into this area in more detail and looking to regulate it better, this is bringing cybersecurity up onto the board level. It's becoming the issues that directors and the board need to be aware of, and not just be aware of, but need to address. And this is in turn is putting the spotlight on ourselves as the CISOs and what we'll be doing to ensure that our organizations that we work for comply with the various regulations and with the various rules, and we are managing and minimizing the risk exposure to the business in relation to cybersecurity. And to tie it off at the end, that Chinese curse actually is a part of a triage, a trilogy of curses. So the first one is, may you live in interesting times. So I think I've just quickly outlined there, we are living in interesting times, unfortunately. May you come to the attention of those in authority. Well, hello, the regulator and the board are now focusing on us. So curse number 2 has come true. Now, hopefully the last one will be a blessing. May the gods give you everything you ask for. So when we go to the board and we're asking for budget and we're asking for investment and we're asking for resources, that we will get them. And I think every time we talk about regulations, I think we look at the negative side, that's forcing us to do something and it's a bad thing. I actually look at the positive side of things. I'm one of those rare people in cybersecurity. He looks on the bright side of things and not always on the pessimistic side. The regulations are a great way to leverage budget and leverage resources and leverage attention. So, may you live in interesting times. May you come to the attention of those in authority. And sincerely, I hope the gods give you everything you ask for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Excellent stuff, and nice and concise there. Just to say before I introduce our next speaker, we will have time for questions to our panel. You can leave a question in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can before we reach the top of the hour. So with that, our next speaker, we're going to tack now towards the data protection and privacy side of things. And I'm delighted to welcome the newly published author of a best-selling title. The book, The Privacy Leader Compass, was launched just back in November, and within 6 weeks, it shot to the top of the bestseller list in its category. Please welcome Dr. Valerie Lyons.
Thanks very much for that, Gordon. Just let me share my presentation here, if that's okay. Are we all good? Can we see that clearly? Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about, thank you, Brian, for covering the cyber side of things. I think we definitely are living in interesting times, if not busy, at least. I'm going to be talking about certain EU regulations, not just all EU regulations, but certain ones that relate to what the EU refers to as the transport of data across borders. So the free transport of data across our borders, so within the EU. So this is part of the EU strategy, and we're going to talk about the EU strategy. And then we're going to talk about the implications that those certain regulations have for privacy frameworks and standards and things like that. So we're going to talk about what are they. And I suppose really, what do we need to do to be ready for what's coming down the road? So I just want to talk to that subject as well. So let's kick it off. Let's take a look, first of all, at what the EU strategy looks like. So what the EU wants to do is to create common European data space. And essentially that translates to a single market for data. Now, why do they want to do this? Well, data is valuable, and we already know what happens when you create really robust legislation for personal data, when we create really robust legislation that's harmonized across Europe, life is easier. It's essentially what it translates to. Consumer trust increases, everybody's happy. And so we want to be able to leverage that increase in consumer trust. We want to create ease of business across those borders. And some might say maybe the EU also wants to try and create difficulty for those beyond those borders. Who knows? But essentially, this is what the EU strategy looks like. Now, how are they going to do that? How are they going to achieve that? And this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a network of various different pieces of legislation. And we're not going to deal with the top stream there, not in this discussion, because they really have nothing to do with data protection or cybersecurity. Then we have two other streams. Okay, we have streams of legislation that have reference to security and privacy, and then we have streams of legislation that have reference to data and services. And then we have one little fella sitting on the edge, and that's the AI Act. And he refers to all three of these strands. But the ones that we're going to be talking about, and the ones that I'm going to be talking about because of the content of data and the relationship with data, are essentially the two bottom streams. So Brian will have already talked about Cybersecurity Act, Cyber Resilience, DORA, Network Information Security. All these things are part of the EU strategy for cybersecurity side of things. But we also have the data and the privacy side of things. So that's what I'm going to cover, which there's no point in talking about GDPR. It's been talked to death. We all know about GDPR. If we're not ready for GDPR, we have a problem. But we're going to talk about mainly the blue stream. Okay, so that's the AI Act, Governance Act, Digital Services, Digital Markets, and the Data Act. They all sound the same, don't they? But they're actually all quite different. So let's do a quick whistle stop tour. Just bear in mind, when we talk about the EU strategy for data, really what they're talking about is the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, and what's called European Common Data Spaces. These data spaces, there's 10 of them, 10 different streams, 10 different areas of data, like airspace data, aviation data, ecosystem data. So there's lots of pharma data, lots of different categories of data. But what we want to be able to do is innovate from that data. So think about health data. It's so important that we share that data across Europe so that we can all benefit from the research that could come from sharing that data. And we don't do that easily now. So that's essentially what this strategy is all about. So those 10 data spaces, here they are. You can see we've got energy, public admin, skills, agriculture, various different things, health up there on the top of that list. But we have the Data Governance Act and we have the Data Act. What's the difference between the two? I know they sound the same. So essentially the Data Governance Act, let's have a quick look at what that actually means. It encourages the reuse of special categories of protected data. Now, they're specific categories rather than what we know as special categories in GDPR. These are specific categories of protected data held by public sector entities. That would really be health data that they're talking about there. And also data about citizens, movement of citizens, social care of citizens, social welfare of citizens. So that data we typically haven't shared cross-border. And they also want to create a framework, a regulatory framework that can happen with safeguards. Now, we're not too sure exactly how those safeguards are going to work. We do know it'll involve a commissioner. And they're also introducing a concept called data altruism. Only the EU can come up with these beautiful little terms and references, but data altruism is a beautiful word that describes sharing data for common good. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here. So that people understand there is a debate that we can share data for the common good, but will powerful entities like the EU take that data and use it for other reasons, and that would be control. So for instance, the sharing of data about your purchases or how much tax you pay, is that going to be used in a way that maybe we wouldn't expect it to be? And that's the debate that's ongoing at the moment, but we're not going to go into that debate, but that's what data altruism is. And they're going to create another board because we don't have enough of them. that was a joke, called the European Data Innovation Board. And that's going to have a commissioner, and it's going to have the ability to create a pathway for these pieces of cross-border transfers to take place more readily and easily, but also with safeguards in place. So there'll be penalties and fines within this space too. And under the Data Governance Act, it's important to note that it covers personal and non-personal data. And this concept of non-personal data, while we might say, well, it's not really privacy then, it actually is confidentiality, but it's not really privacy. So we're dead right there. That intersection between cybersecurity and privacy, this is where we see that intersection powerfully, because we do have to present mechanisms to protect the confidentiality of non-personal data. And now we're going to have huge data lakes of non-personal data that will in fact be able to identify personal individuals because there's so much data in there. So we know what it's going to look like, but these are the issues that we have with the Data Governance Act. But this is what it's trying to achieve. We also have the Data Act. So what's the difference between the Data Governance Act and the Data Act? Well, the Data Act is really about the Internet of Things. I'm very much summarizing it so that people can kind of understand the difference. The Data Governance Act is about cross-border transfers of large quantities of data from 10 different bodies, 10 different sectors. This act is all about data subject rights. Your right to say, I want my Internet of Things data because I want the right to repair readily and I want the right to repair more easily, but I need my Internet of Things data to be able to come with my product. So at the moment, we don't have those rights, and that's essentially what we're trying to achieve here is the safeguarding of Internet of Things data. So it breaks it down into 5 streams, data sharing, but you can see a big one here is the prohibition of unfair terms. So in our terms and conditions, we have to have the right to be able to access our Internet of Things data. So we're moving beyond privacy here, and you can see where the EU is going with this. It's not just personal data, it's any data, because now with AI, we have the ability to take any data and derive personal data from it. So we're looking at a much broader reach, okay? And then finally, we have the AI Act. The stinky little picture here because it was created by AI to describe what AI looks like. So I thought it was a dinky little representation, but the AI Act, it identifies a series of risks. You know, there's things you can do and there's things you can't do. Some might say, isn't it obvious? Well, of course it is obvious what those categories should be, but what we want to do is we want to put in penalties for anybody who breaches those. Now, you can see that it's a very EU-centric piece of legislation because, for instance, social scoring is allowed in other countries. And we also know that mass surveillance is allowed in other countries. So we know that it's very EU-centric. But we're going to talk about the Brussels effect later on, and we'll see what happens with the EU Act when it actually is finalised. So we have our full draft now. When will it happen? I think it's going to happen mid-2024. We know we get 2 years, pretty much. That seems to be the indicator. 2 years to ready for legislation. So I think this is timely. But we have 4 major categories, and it tells us under each category what we can or cannot do. So what are the implications of all of these pieces of legislation? Well, the first one is that these are risk-based approaches. So that means we have to consider the risk, and the higher the risk, the stricter the risk, the rules that need to be in place. All of them follow the same basis. It's the GDPR, same basis, risk-based approach. These are the frameworks and standards that we have in flow at the moment. So we have some are legislative, some are standards. We can use those standards to attest to, or we can use those standards as a guide. We have the NIST privacy framework. It's more frequently used in the US than it is here, However, a lot of larger organizations are adopting the NIST privacy framework. It's a really, really good framework, as is 27701. We also have the transatlantic data transfer framework, which essentially allows that cross-border transfer between the US and the EU. And then for other APEC countries, we have the APEC privacy framework. And then there's a whole myriad, depending on what country you're in, family and health sector specific legislation that sits into these frameworks. So for instance, HIPAA in the US, or in our own Clinical Data and Research Act. So there's lots of different pieces of legislation that sit into these frameworks. I wouldn't be able to list them all here. So what are the major implications? Well, one of them is privacy by design. It's stated in GDPR, as we all know, so it's mandatory. We didn't get very good at it, but we're going to have to get really good at it now because it's in the GGA and it's in the AI Act. So privacy by design is an absolute minimum standard. If we have not got on top of privacy by design from GDPR, we will need to get on top of it for the AI Act and for the DGA. And then we have other implications that we are not really ready for, and that is the enhanced fairness and safety features that are required essentially by the Digital Service Act. So the DMA and the DSA. The Digital Service Act is really about online safety and online codes. So the Digital Service Act mandates that we need to think about what we're offering. For instance, are we offering services to children? Well, if so, here is a code you need to follow for children. Are we offering services to vulnerable individuals? Well, here is a code about how we handle data. So we were never given such prescriptive forms before. We were just told we had to ensure that there was a balance between our needs as an organization and the vulnerable. And did we take that balance into account when we were doing our data protection impact assessments? And that's what we've been asked to do previously. Now with the DSA, we need to enhance fairness and safety features. The data protection impact assessment. If you thought it was hard before GDPR or after GDPR, it's going to change. So how is it going to change? Well, it's going to extend, and it is going to extend significantly. Where is it going to extend? Well, one of the first things, you're going to have to do the safety and fairness assessments now as part of your DPIA. So when you do a data protection impact assessment, you will have to do additional evaluations against certain codes. You'll also, from an AI perspective, have to incorporate impact assessments. So we're going to be looking there at just because you can doesn't mean you should. Then we'll also have to consider human rights assessments. And there's already a framework called the Human Rights Ethical Impact Assessment. It's by a data protection lawyer and researcher called Alessandro Mantelero. So he wrote a paper about it in 2018, and it is a great example of how you extend the data protection impact assessment to include ethical impact assessments and human rights assessments. And we have to categorize risk according to the AI categorizations. We've never done this before. We're going to have to start thinking about how we incorporate that into our data protection impact assessments. And I think the huge impact of all of this is that we're no longer going to have a data protection impact assessment. You heard it here first. That's what I think is going to happen about 2025, 2026. We're going to have a DIA, a data impact assessment. And in that, you're going to be looking at personal data, non-personal data, and you're going to be doing an impact assessment on it all. So that is going to be a huge impact of these pieces of legislation. And so I think, get to understand your DPIAs. As Brian already outlined, policies, guidelines that come from those policies, they're all going to have to be updated. Some new ones are going to have to be introduced, for instance, an AI policy. Some will also have to be communicated to your customers. If you're going to be adhering to codes, you'll have to publish those codes. Not everybody will have to adhere to those codes. There'll be certain rules and categorizations about adhering to certain codes. So we'll have a series of different things that we're going to have to publish and we're going to have to communicate to our customers. And then the Brussels effect. Now, the Brussels effect is going to impact everybody. And essentially what that is Brussels is writing legislation. It started with GDPR, and that is legislation that has what's called an extraterritorial effect. It doesn't just apply in Europe. It applies to anybody who's processing the data of European residents or European data subjects. Many people will use the term European citizens, but it doesn't actually say that in any piece of legislation. So it's European residents and data subjects. And if you target them in any way, the Brussels effect kicks in. And it's so important to understand what that means. Every piece of legislation that Europe creates doesn't get created just for Europe. It gets created for European data subjects and residents, which means any organization, particularly the US, will need to, in fact, adopt either similar legislation or the same legislation. So we see this Brussels effect happening now with privacy legislation right across the world, where organizations are adopting, or countries are adopting pieces of legislation that are exact replicas of GDPR because of the Brussels effect. And so finally, for the readiness piece, what are we going to do to ready for this? So I think the first thing we'll have to do is do an assessment of the systemic risks that our services, the use of our services, the products that we produce, the mitigation measures and compliance to supervisory authorities. So we need to figure out what does that look like. And unfortunately, I don't have the answers to this because, for instance, we don't even know what the commission looks like for the DGA. So there's a piece missing so far. A review of the policies. Okay, we're going to have to look at our ISMS. We're going to have to look at our PIMS if we're implementing, say, ISO 27001 or 701. We'll have to look at that and see, do we need to extend it? Do those policies need to be extended? For instance, where 42001 in the ISO range for the AI regulation, do we need to look at our ISMS and see, do we either create a new one for 42001 or do we extend? We don't know what this is going to look like. I suspect we're going to get a 70 something from the ISO that will allow us to extend our 701, our ISO 2701 compliance. Privacy by design will have to incorporate transparency, fairness, and proportionality, which I think is fantastic because they're three principles that really we are weak on from a GDPR perspective. So I think we're going to see that becoming much more robust requirement there. Learn how to deal with multiple stakeholders because we're going to have so many boards, we're going to have so many commissioners, at least 4, and we already have 3. So we're going to have at least 4. Inventory assessments to determine the products. We have organizations that are using AI tools and they don't know that they are. So we're going to have to get a handle on those tools that we're using. And then we're going to have to review the processes. What are we doing with various different services? Are we using intermediary services? We need to evaluate those services against the various laws if we do. And then finally, technical planning or various commitments that necessitate change to the design or functionality of these online user interfaces. So we need to get a handle on the planning before it happens. There's a schedule. I have a kind of a vague idea in my head. Digital Service Act is already in force. Digital Markets Act is already in force, but it affects very few organizations, just the big ones. The AI Act is going to be in force. It's going to start about midway through 2024, we reckon. Data Governance Act, it is already in force, and the Data Act is already going. It's going to be mid-2024. So we know 2024 is going to be a big year for these pieces of legislation. I think it's time to start planning. So I think planning is another piece of readiness that we get there. And that's the whistle-stop tour of how I believe these acts are going to have an influence on those privacy frameworks and what we're going to have to do. And it really doesn't matter which privacy framework you're using. It really doesn't matter what standard you're adhering to. There is going to be an impact, and it's going to be similar across all of them. That brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And with that, we'll open the floor to Q&A. Do please add your questions. As I mentioned at the top, they will be anonymous, so you don't have to worry about, in the interest of privacy and data protection, you don't have to worry about your name being shared here. I see no questions so far. So just while people are maybe thinking and digesting about the content they've heard so far, I'll kick it off. I'll turn to Brian first and then ask Valerie this one. And we've heard some references throughout both of your presentations to standards. So how can they help to prepare? Let's talk, Brian, first of all, on the security side, and then I'll bring Valerie in on the privacy side. You've already referred to a couple, but let's talk standards. What standards or frameworks can help people get ready for some of the legislation and regulations that are coming along?
It's a good question, Gordon, and it's one that we're often asked by people when we're on this topic. And none of the regulations will stipulate that you have to use a particular standard because it's just the way things are. But we would hear regulators often recommend using particular standards. One of the big ones obviously would be ISO 27001. So if you are using a standard such as ISO 27001, that is a great way to demonstrate and provide evidence to a regulator when they're examining you, if they're auditing you or investigating you on foot of a breach or a complaint, that you are implementing and following industry recognized good practices in putting things in place. There are other standards out there. There's NIST, NIST, which is the US cybersecurity framework, NIST 800. That is quite popular and very good as well. The only caveat I would say using NIST would be that unlike ISO 27001, you can't get certified to NIST. So you can be certified to ISO 27001. You can get an external body to come in, audit you, and certify you in accordance with the ISO standards. There isn't a similar framework with NIST. There is Cyber Essentials, which has been run out of the UK, which is a UK standard, which various Irish companies have adopted as well, particularly in the SME sector, to demonstrate they've got good security. There is talk of an Irish standard coming out that the NCSC is that's National Cybersecurity Standard is looking at introducing a cybersecurity standard for Ireland aimed at SMEs in line with NIST 2 being published, but we haven't had any details of that yet. So if somebody to say to me, Brian, what standard should we use? What could I use from a cybersecurity point of view to demonstrate that we're following good practice, etc. on cybersecurity? I'd strongly recommend looking at ISO 27001.
Okay, thank you. And then Valerie, as I bring you in, I'll just pick up on a thing that Brian mentioned there, which is the importance of certification. He mentioned that, for instance, you can get certified to ISO 27001, but not to NIST. In the privacy and data protection sphere, how important is it to get certified? Is that a question of showing consumers, for instance, that you take privacy seriously? Is it helpful or necessary, do you think, for organizations to get certified to an external standard to show that they're doing privacy right?
I think it much depends on the nature of the business, what the business does. Obviously, adhering to a standard allows us to demonstrate very readily, very easily to all stakeholders, not just to our customers, but to the regulator, to our shareholders, to the wider community. So we get an opportunity through certification to communicate that rather readily. But when we talk about doing privacy right, and it applies with cybersecurity too, we don't need to have certification to do things right or to communicate that to our communities and our stakeholders. Just makes it easier to do that. So for instance, if I was adhering to the NIST framework for privacy rather than 27,000, I would be implementing a very robust framework, and I might be communicating that in my CSO report. But I'm not getting any assurance that it's ongoing, whereas I will get that from certification, because if I want to maintain my certification, I have to be able to prove that it's an ongoing thing. And I think certification also, it brings a level of accountability. It says, well, we won't be able to certify next year if we don't keep this level of protection up and this level and culture in our organization up. So I think certification helps to enhance the culture. But for the smaller organizations, or for the organizations that might struggle to certify because they can't cover everything, even if they could use a framework to get 95% of the way there, then I think that's fantastic. So I wouldn't say to any organization, it's a standard or nothing. I think standards are incredibly important. I think that they provide something that frameworks will never be able to provide. Frameworks are a great starting point.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Just to add in what Valerie says there as well, I think the other parties you have to take into account there is, particularly with something like NIS2 or your supply chain, is that you have to demonstrate to your customer that you have good security in place. And I think anybody in this call is probably well familiar with the Excel spreadsheet that you get sent with 100, 200 questions on cybersecurity to send back. But we are seeing a lot of organizations kind of circumventing that by saying, the first question generally being, are you certified to an internationally recognized standard in relation to, if it's cybersecurity, or if it's in privacy, in privacy like ISO 27701 or the Euro privacy standard. And if you are, just send us a copy of your certificate and your scope, and that's it. You don't have to fill out all these questions. And standards can also be a great way for you reassuring your board that you are managing cybersecurity in a great way. Instead of standing in front of your board going, "Don't worry, I'm doing a good job. We're grand. Trust me." You can turn around and sort of say, "Yeah, look, I'm doing a good job. We're grand. Trust me." And also, look, here's evidence that we are following industry standards. So standards can be tough to get. They are a cost, but I would actually say when it comes to your business, you need to look at, well, is it a cost, or is this going to be an investment that is going to be allow us to better engage with customers, be they corporate or consumer customers, or with the regulator, or with our board and senior management as well.
Great point that about the cost versus investment. We have a question from the floor here. I'll put this to Valerie first, since you briefly touched on AI. And the question goes, should we expect a broadly used ISO standard or equivalent to implement an AI management system? Any thoughts there?
Well, we do have an ISO regulation for AI governance, 42100. But I think we should expect to see an extension to ISO 27001, which will kind of cover DSA pieces of privacy, because we have privacy codes now in DSA, and we have privacy pieces in AI. And I think that the 27001 extension 701, it covered GDPR. It covered the gap that was created by the introduction of GDPR. And now a gap has been created in privacy by the introduction of the AI Act and the DSA. And I think what we're going to see is possibly another extension. I would like to see it, because then that would mean we'd have one standard, the ISO 27001 standard, that would do cybersecurity and privacy and cover all aspects of privacy. So for me, it would be nice, but I don't know necessarily that it will happen that way. It may be that it's going to stay in the governance space, and we're just going to see ISO having their AI Governance Act, and that we'll have to move into that ISO standard in order to get the AI Act elements addressed. But then what about the DSA elements? I don't know what we're going to see there. I'd like to see it all kept within the 27001 family suite of standards. That would be my preference, simply because what we end up having is one language to address cybersecurity and privacy. We have them talking the same language. They talk now in management systems, they talk in words that both of them understand. Whereas prior to that, we would have cybersecurity people talking about bits and bytes and privacy people talking about articles. And so never the two shall meet. Whereas with 27701, we found that they had a common language. And that common language is a real bonus to be able to kind of get privacy and cybersecurity to work together. So I'd like to see it extend, but I don't know necessarily that it will.
Okay, thank you. And then just the second part of that question for you there, Brian, is can organizations afford to wait for these types of guidance and frameworks to be published to see if there's industry consensus, or do we need to be taking our own best efforts in the meantime?
Well, actually, there is a ISO standard for artificial intelligence systems. So there's the ISO 42001 standard, which is for the governance and management of AI technologies. So, you know, like ISO are not going to lose an opportunity to create yet another standard for us to have to pay to download their standard and get applied for. But you know, I agree with Valerie. I think over time you may see a convergence of different standards. But I think maybe one of the first challenges we have to do, speaking of common languages, even, you know, is it privacy or privacy? Is it data or data? You know, and if we can get our American cousins to speak properly, maybe we can solve that problem first. But yes, there is a standard there already, so there's no need to wait.
Okay, excellent. So we still have some time for questions, so please, I would encourage anyone who does have a question for the panel, please drop a question into the Q&A and maybe say whether the question is for Valerie or for Brian. Just in the meantime, while we're waiting, I'll put this question back to you, Brian, and then maybe to you as well, Valerie. Have you any views on whether the risk with regulations is that it will force people into a compliance mindset rather than doing things right? Actually, I'll bring Valerie in on this first, because I know you've got strong views on doing privacy right rather than just doing privacy rights and ticking a box, so to speak. So what about the risk that regulations could force that compliance mindset rather than pushing people simply to see it as a baseline from which they expand and improve?
Yeah, you could say that's a risk, but I think the bigger risk is that people do nothing without regulation, because that's what we saw before. So we know that we had a directive for 20 years, and when the privacy directive, the data protection directive. So after 20 years, when suddenly we had a regulation, people said, oh, this is going to be so much work to get to compliance with this regulation. But the answer was, you're supposed to have been doing it for 20 years. There's hardly anything new in here. It's, you know, it's literally a jumped up version of what the directive was, but suddenly you've got fines. And now you're complaining about how much it's going to take you to get to compliance. So we knew, and the EU knew, that the directive approach, which essentially is the approach that's followed by the US. And that is the discretionary approach, where your customer demand will make you respond. That capitalist approach, it doesn't work in the vulnerable space. So where we have an imbalance of power, it doesn't work in that space. And so we need regulation. So I think where we might say, well, isn't there a risk? We could say there's 500 risks in introducing regulation. Isn't there going to be an increase in cost? There's so many risks in introducing regulation, but what it's trying to do is to address the bigger and biggest risk of them all, and that is inertia, doing nothing. And I think that that's the biggest risk of all. And I think to address that risk, the introduction of legislation is really the only solution. Do I think that organizations will take a compliance-based approach where compliance is their goal rather than their baseline? Absolutely. It's what they've always done. It's it's about the money. But some companies will try to use the consumer trust-based approach, where you look at enhancing consumer trust and engendering consumer trust. And I think that they'll make the greatest book. But it needs for them to prove it. And then other organizations will follow. But I think regulation is a minimum standard that's required, because organizations don't comply if there is no regulation.
Okay, thank you. And what about, Brian, on the cybersecurity side, which is maybe not as prominent in the consumer's mind, as privacy would be? So again, that push and pull, the tension between compliance versus doing more? Where do you think things are going to fall, or do you think there's certainly an advantage to be had by going just beyond mere compliance?
Well, to answer that, the end part of your statement there, Gordon, absolutely, there is an advantage to go beyond mere compliance. You know, many of the regulations we talk about, PCI DSS, albeit it's not a regulation, I take that on board, but they should not be seen as the unattainable or this high bar to be achieved. In many cases, they are the bare minimum, or the entry level you should be doing if you're going to have a good, robust cybersecurity program in place. So I think what we're seeing is a result of, as I said, the market not looking after cybersecurity and not taking it seriously, even though every statement that when there is a breach that comes out says we take cybersecurity seriously. And it's going to change our industry and change our roles. I think what it's going to push on is very much the role of the CISO and the security professional is going to change for very much so, from being not just focused on technology and that, but also being able to engage with the business risk. Like an example I would give is that if in BH Consulting, if I want any electric wiring done in BH Consulting, I am legally bound under Irish law to have a qualified electrician come in and change the plugs or change the electricity. Same if we need any plumbing done, I have to get a qualified tradesperson to come in and do that. I want cybersecurity done. Well, there's no regulations or standards regarding that, and I think this is where the industry is going. And we can stand up and say no, this is not how it should be, and we're special snowflakes, we shouldn't be taken this way, or we turn around and we embrace and we shape and we evolve and develop cybersecurity, not just as a profession, as an industry, but also as a key contributor to making our world a safer place.
Okay, thank you. Just in the very quick time that we have left, we do have one more question that I would like to get to, and it's which regulations or directives hold the most significance for a non-profit organization? So Valerie, I might bring you back in just before we wrap up.
So of the current legislation, well, the answer is all legislation. It's not like you can pick and choose and say which one. But the most important one is GDPR. It's the baseline, from which all other things will never work if you don't have it. So GDPR is a must, and I'm obviously coming at it from a privacy perspective. GDPR is a must. AI is only going to apply if you're using AI. But from the non-profit perspective, I don't think it makes any difference really in terms of you still have to comply. You're never going to be in the Digital Markets Act if you're, a non-profit. It goes without saying. But you may be dealing with children's data, and if you are, and you're offering them services, you may have to look at the Digital Service Act, and it suddenly becomes very important because there's penalties in the DSA. So GDPR is a starting point. AI, if you have it, and or are you going to use it? Are you going to offer it? And then the DSA. It's unlikely that the Data Governance Act, when I say unlikely, it depends on what space you're in. But you'd have to look at the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. But it's unlikely that they're going to be applicable.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, we have reached the top of the hour. I want to thank all of the contributors who contributed questions, to all of the participants, everybody who took time out of their schedules to attend, and of course to Dr. Valerie Lyons and to Brian Honan. Thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.